A proper understanding of money must be preceded by a historical comprehension of mercantilism. The mercantilist era took shape in Europe from roughly the 16th to the 18th centuries as nation-states consolidated power, colonial trade expanded, and bullion, gold, and silver was seen as the core measure of wealth. Mercantilism, broadly defined as the belief in the benefits of profitable trading or commercialism, posited that wealth could be generated by exporting more than one imports. This idea prompted governments to adopt protectionist postures, creating barriers to incoming foreign trade, providing entitlements or monopolies to domestic traders, and even restricting the export of precious metals. Trade, in the mercantilist vision, was no longer simply the exchange of values, but a channel to accumulate gold and silver by selling manufactured goods. The more a country exported, the more bullion it would acquire, and the wealthier it would become in a world where the financial system was anchored in those commodities. The roots of mercantilism lie in the decline of feudal orders, the rise of centralized monarchies, and the dawn of global exploration and trade. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire and the city was renamed Istanbul. The conquest disrupted Silk Road continuity, encouraging European powers to seek maritime routes to Asia, setting in motion the age of discovery and colonial expansion. As voyages by Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and others opened new routes to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, European powers were confronted with vast flows of precious metals and the challenge of how to channel them into a national advantage. The doctrine of mercantilism took form. National wealth was equated with bullion held, trade surpluses were prized, and state intervention was essential. Prominent figures illustrating the idea and practice of mercantilism include Thomas Munn, 1571 to 1641, an English merchant who wrote of export surpluses, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, 1619 to 1683, finance minister to Louis XIV in France, whose policies emphasized industrial development, tariffs, and state-led trade promotion, and William Petty, 1623 to 1687, among the early political economy thinkers in England. Their work and that of their contemporaries institutionalized the export surplus logic. The central tenets of mercantilism were several. First, that national wealth is measured by stocks of treasure, especially gold and silver. Second, that trade is a zero-sum game. One nation's gain is another's loss. Hence, exports should exceed imports, and bullion should flow inward. Third, that the state must intervene in trade, industry, and colonies by imposing tariffs, granting monopolies, controlling shipping, and seeking captive colonial markets. Fourth, that colonies served as sources of raw materials and as markets for finished goods, a critical part of the mercantilist empire model. This logic grounded the fierce trade rivalry among European powers from the late 1500s onward, the chartering of trading companies, and the use of military and naval force to defend trade privileges. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Kingdom of Spain stood at the forefront of mercantilist enterprise in Europe, thanks to the massive inflows of precious metals from its colonial empire. Beginning in the early decades after 1492, the Spanish crown and its colonial apparatus worked to channel gold and silver extracted from the Americas back to Spain under tightly controlled trade arrangements. From the 1560s onward, Spain perfected what became known as the treasure fleet or flota system. Two major convoys sailed annually from Seville, or Cadiz, to the Americas, one to Mexico, New Spain, and the other to Caribbean ports of South America, and returned laden with bullion, gemstones, pearls, and exotic goods. The theory was that these bullion flows bolstered national wealth and power. Under the logic of mercantilism, that exports must exceed imports, and that a stockpile of gold and silver anchored a nation's strength. Spain's colonial trade was rigidly structured so that its American possessions served the mother country. Raw materials and precious metals flowed out, while finished goods often flowed in, and Spanish merchant guilds such as the Consulado de Mercaderes in Seville enjoyed virtual monopolies over colonial shipping. Although Spain's long-term trajectory revealed structural weaknesses, its industry remained underdeveloped, inflation and debt burdened the crown, and in time its dominance declined. The initial benefit of mercantilist policy for Spain was overwhelming in the 16th century. In parallel, the influences of mercantilism were vigorously pursued by the Dutch Republic, the Netherlands, and by England, later Britain, in the 17th century. In 1651, the English Parliament passed the first of the Navigation Acts, legislation aimed explicitly at restricting the shipping of colonial and Asian goods to English vessels, and thereby channeling trade profits and tonnage to the mother country. By requiring that goods imported into England and its colonies from Asia, Africa, or America travel on English-registered ships, England adopted a protectionist and mercantilist posture. Trade was a means of national revenue, control, and privilege, not simply exchange between equals. For the Dutch Republic, although the treaty and legislative details are not spelled here, the period of the Dutch Golden Age, early to mid-16th century, saw Dutch trading companies such as the Dutch East India Company, VOC, achieve dominance in maritime commerce, shipping manufactured goods, spices, and bullion around the world, thus applying mercantilist logic of export control, colonized resource access, and shipping supremacy. Meanwhile, in France, the era of mercantilism found its most forceful architect in Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who served as Controller General of Finances, 1665 to 1683, and Secretary of State for the Navy under King Louis XIV. Colbert's policies, sometimes labeled Colbertism, embodied the mercantilist ideal. He believed that the wealth and economy of France must serve the state, and that accumulation of bullion, promotion of exports, and suppression of imports were central to national strength. Under his direction, France promoted domestic manufactures, particularly luxury goods such as tapestries, silk, porcelain, imposed protective tariffs, recruited skilled foreign artisans, built up the merchant and naval fleet, and invested in infrastructure such as roads, canals, and shipbuilding yards. The result was that France increased its industrial output, expanded its share of international trade, and strengthened its military capacity in a competitive Europe. Together, these countries and rulers exemplify how mercantilist policy translated into national advantage. Spain's early bullion flows financed empire and warfare. England's trade legislation secured shipping and colonial profits. The Netherlands dominated global shipping and commerce. France under Colbert built manufacturing and naval power. The timeline of benefit thus runs roughly as follows. From the early 16th century, Spain's treasure fleet set the gold and silver standard. In the mid-17th century, England and the Netherlands institutionalized trade regulation and chartered companies. In the later 17th century, France deployed a full mercantilist program of manufacturing, protectionism, and state-led trade. It is important, however, to recognize that the benefits of mercantilism were uneven and sometimes fragile. Spain, despite its early windfall of bullion, did not develop a strong manufacturing base and in time suffered from debt, inflation, and economic stagnation. The Netherlands, and England too, found that external competition, colonial revolt, naval cost, and changing global trade patterns eroded their early dominance. In France, Colbert's gains were offset by later wars and the heavy financial burden of the state. In other words, while the mechanism of mercantilism offered significant short to medium-term gains via trade surpluses, bullion accumulation, and state control, the long-term success required adaptation, industrial capacity, and flexible trade regimes. The rise of the Industrial Revolution shifted the economic focus away from bullion accumulation toward manufacturing, capital investment, and technological innovation. Intellectual critiques also mounted. For example, David Hume, 1711 to 1776, questioned the idea that piling up money was equivalent to wealth and argued instead for the function of money as a medium of exchange rather than an end in itself. At the same time, in 1776, Adam Smith published his landmark An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which challenged core mercantilist assumptions, argued for the productivity of labor, the division of labor, and free markets as the path to national wealth. By that point, many economists view mercantilism as a retrospective label, a applied to practices that preceded the formal discipline of economics itself. In short, while mercantilist policies did not disappear overnight, the logic underpinning them, export surplus, bullion accumulation, state-led trade monopoly, gave way to a new paradigm of economic thought and policy. Understanding mercantilism thus matters for our modern comprehension of money and economics. This era conflated bullion with national wealth, tied trade policy directly to state power, and gave rise to the notion that trade surpluses and intervention could make a nation powerful. In effect, it sets the stage against which the later evolution of economics must be understood, how our view of money evolved from precious metal hoarding to modern financial systems, how trade moved from zero-sum rivalry to comparative advantage and mutual gain, and how the role of the state in economic affairs shifted over time.